In this lesson, we'll be fine-tuning the camera, lights, textures, and the site model. So since the end of the last lesson, I've gone back into Photoshop and I've just slightly desaturated that HDR image, very much in the same way that we had gone and blurred it. So I just found that it was giving a little bit too much of a yellow tone to the entire image, so I desaturated it ever so slightly, and this is the result, which is the blank canvas that we're going to start working on. So a few adjustments I'd like to make. I'd like to first of all change the camera position. So using the orbit camera toggle, let's just go and rotate around the site and let's just see which of the views look best from our particular view. Now I know that over here we're going to have a bridge element, so I'd like to be on this side, and I think it's quite interesting seeing this bridge in the background as well, so it gives you a little bit more of a contextual feel. So again, you want to make sure that your camera doesn't focus on the museum itself, but rather on your project that you're going to be working on, but also make sure that you do show some of the context so that there is a reference to what you've been modeling. Also, it's a good idea to have a look at what your camera is actually going to see in the aspect ratio that you have selected within your output size. So for example, if I go and type in Shift F, I'm going to get a cropped view of what my camera aspect ratio is going to be showing. And very often, especially if you have very wide panoramic views set up, you want to make sure that you keep that on when you're adjusting your camera, just so that you get a more accurate representation of what you're going to be seeing. The next thing that you want to do when your camera has been set up, let's say we are happy with this angle, I'm going to choose an angle which is slightly higher as well, since I think it works better for these type of modeling shots where we're going to be doing virtual models. So I'm going to choose something right about over there and zoom out slightly. So if I'm happy with that, then the next thing to do is to have a look at your camera setting again. And in some cases when you are lower, you can use guess vertical. But if I had to do that from this very high bird's eye view, I'm going to get a very distorted image. But in some cases it may be correct if you're more or less horizontal between your camera and your target. So I'm going to choose not to use that so that we get a more natural view from this high angle. And the next thing I'd like to do is to swap my lighting around, because the fact that I'm on this side now, I need to go and have my primary light, the one that's doing most of the lighting in the scene, on the opposite side of the camera. Otherwise we're going to have a very washed out scene. So having moved the camera, you must remember that your lighting will have to adjust as well. So if you want to have multiple camera views, you can also have two sets of bright lights and then just turn them on and off depending on which camera you are using. The main idea is just to not have a completely washed out scene by placing a direct camera behind the camera back. So here I'm going to be doing this sort of a setup. I'm going to see how that looks in a test render shortly. And the other thing that we can move on to right now is to look at what type of a texture setup we can use to get something looking a little bit more like a physical model. So remember that if you hit F10, you can go into the override material toggle, you can turn it on and off. And once you've turned it off, if you want to start experimenting with other materials, let's go and set up two balsa, or at least one balsa material and one water material for ourselves so that we can prepare our scene. So first of all, let's go and hit standard, go down to V-Ray material, and this one is going to be a balsa dark. And into the diffuse, we can go and put the bitmap, which is within our 3D Max files and textures. So you can use the balsa gray. And what we're going to do here is later on we can go and add in very slight reflections and better settings for that material. At the moment, what I want to do is keep the material rendering as fast as possible so that we don't lose any time in our workflow as we develop our actual design. So I'm going to keep all of this exactly as it is. I'm going to make a copy of that and call this one Balsa Light. I'm going to replace that by the light version, and I'm going to make another copy, and this one's going to be called water. But instead of a material, I'm going to right click and clear that. I'm just going to choose a very gray dark blue, and I'm going to make that reflective. Then reflective glossiness, just to not make it look like a mirror, I'm going to type in 0.95. And I'm going to see what happens if I need to increase those reflective glossiness. If I need to decrease this amount to make it a little bit more blurry, I will see as we go along. I'm not going to give it a bump or anything to make it look like real water, because remember that we're going for that model look. We don't want to create anything that looks photorealistic in this case. So now let's go and apply our texture to the site model, the bridges, and that's all going to be in the Balsa Dark. Our platform can be Balsa Light, as well as the entire model that we're going to build, and the water object can be in the water texture. So once that is applied, let's go now and do our UV mapping. So into the modifier list, let's go and type in UVW and hit enter. It's going to have box mapping, and the only thing to remember here is to use a bitmap fit, and then just to choose that Balsa as your bitmap so that it has the correct aspect ratio of that texture. Back in the material slot, good idea just to remember to turn on show material in viewport for both of those textures that do have bitmaps applied. So now let's look at this building a little bit closer and start applying this texture. So I'm going to choose a mapping which goes horizontally, pretty much the same way that I would do it if I had to cut this out of thick balsa myself. And then if you're happy with that, you can perhaps go and make this slightly smaller, a little bit finer. And if we're happy with that, we can then go and copy that by right-clicking and pasting an instance of that onto our base object. If you do see any repetition, we can either go into Photoshop and try and make that a little bit neater, or we can simply go and increase the size. Let's just go and make that unique. And then for the site, let's go and increase that balsa size ever so slightly. For the bridges, let's use the same mapping. So again, I'm going to copy and right-click, paste instanced. So in this one, we do actually want to make it unique, because here we will have to rotate that. If I right click and go into Gizmo, rotate that UV mapping by 90 degrees. So as you can see, that Z value showed 90 degrees. And if I zoom into my bridge element, you'll see that the grain is running in the length of the bridge, which is how we would do it if we had to cut it out. So equally so here, I can use the same mapping that I used for the main site. I can just drag that across, and that should pretty much do it. So now let's hit C on the keyboard. Let's have a look at Cam01. Let's quickly do a render, and let's have a look at what the result is. So there is our render result. You can see that our balsa texture is starting to show. It's not looking ultra realistic because we don't have any very light reflections in our balsa. It's just a plain texture on the V-Ray material, so nothing glamorous about it yet, but we are going to get there. As we develop, we are going to come back to the materials at the end of the course and give them a little bit more bling so that we can get some juice out of them as we create our final images. Remember, at the moment, you just want to keep your render time as low as possible, keep your reflective glossiness as low as possible, don't create too many subdivisions in any of your materials, and all of these things are just going to help you set up your scene so that you have a very, very quick workflow so that your modeling process and everything afterwards happens as easily and quickly as possible. So once you're happy with this, you can still make a few adjustments. For example, if you'd like to come in now and do a few more modeling adjustments, you can, but I would honestly recommend that you leave as much of that alone, and you rather do it if you have time, which you obviously won't because we never do, at the end of the process. So what you want to do really is to jump into the design process of your building instead of fidgeting with little arcs and windows and details that no one is really going to care about once your entire building is blocking the view anyway. So these things are very often done incorrectly in studios where people spend hours or days or even weeks building a perfect context model, but their building that they're supposed to be working on is completely blank. So my number one tip for this entire section of the course up till now is focus on what's important and get your design going as quickly as possible once your stage is set up and you can start your process. So that's exactly what we're going to do in the next lesson. We're now going to cut all of the context model work out the way. We're going to leave that for the end, and we're going to start looking at how we can design our building on this blank canvas of ours. And all of that exciting stuff is happening from the next lesson.